Hello everyone. Welcome as always to Ludo History. And today I am so excited to be joined by Jeremiah McCall, the author of Gaming the Past, and really one of the foremost voices in exploring how to teach with video games. So,
Oh,
Chad, please
nice of
join
you to
me.
say. Thank you so much. Sorry.
Yeah, so please join me, Chad, in giving him a very warm welcome. So, do you want to introduce yourself and your background a little bit, Jeremiah, for people who are less immersed in the historical game studies field?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a high school history teacher by training and have been doing that for, well, I guess by career, maybe not by training. By training, I have a PhD in Greek and Roman history, and have done some work as a Roman historian. But I teach high school history, and have been doing that for 22 years, and have been working over the years, among other things, to work with historical games and try and have them be used as critical tools in formal history education. So you'd mentioned Gaming the Past. I wrote that about a decade ago, and the second edition is coming out at the end of this year. I think November is the slated date, and it's a guidebook for teachers on how to use historical video games. How do you select them? How could they be used in the class? What kinds of sort of analysis do you do with them, and things like that. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to start with Gaming the Past because I think, obviously, that's, I think, a really important tool that in many ways was ahead of its time because, what was that, 2011 that the first edition came out?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I like
right.
I like to think that too. I mean, it's based on people's reception in the community this time. It sounds like it's about right. It sounds like maybe it was 11 years too early. So here we go.
Honestly, because even like Rob Hodden and some of the other folks now working with teaching with games are like picking up steam within the last 5 to 10 years, and right, I think of like, you know, in my mind, one of the foundational texts of the modern field, playing with the past, was 2013. So even 2 years
Mhm.
after you wrote. So I'm curious, I guess to start with, how have you seen the field change over the last 10 years? And how has
Sure.
I guess
Uh,
in 2022, the related thing is, what is the most important thing you think about teaching with games?
so I think what's changed mostly is the actual academic study of historical games. When I wrote Gaming in the Past, and I first started talking about using history games in classroom settings 2005, I was at an education arcade, which was attached to the old E3 conferences, and I did a talk there. And I think that I can only tell you sort of anecdotally because it's really hard. People don't necessarily loudly identify that they're teaching with games. The practice seems to have expanded. There seem to be more people using it, but really, I think the part that has certainly taken off and developed is this idea of games as serious subjects for history study. And I think that's been really, really helpful for me as I, do this second edition approach and try and encourage more teachers to take risks and, use what is. I mean, this is a cultural medium of ours, right? I
Yeah.
mean, games are really important. And so I think the developing field of historical game studies is sort of given a little more weight, a little more credibility to this idea of history and games. But I think we're still new. I think we're still trying to figure out how to use these things effectively.
Yeah, I super agree. And I'm curious, obviously, high school has a lot of standardized testing to get around. A lot of those Common Core standards. Uh, Even at upper levels, right? Gotta teach two AP tests, etc. So, how do you kind of navigate that with
Yeah.
games?
Yeah, it's a great question. I happen to be very fortunate. I happen to teach at an independent school, so we're not covered by most state mandated content and curriculum tests. And I have all the respect in the world for teachers that do need to kind of be aware of those standards while they're teaching. I guess what I would say is, and this is something I've developed over the time period between the two books. I think there's some if if you are interested in media criticism exercises, if you're interested in leveraging the appeal and the features of historical games, there's some way you can get it into your classrooms, even if all you can do is spare one class. If you have one 50-minute class all year that you could not be working on other things, then you could do some games in the classroom. And I'm trying to continue to expand. Well, how might somebody do that? Because absolutely, there's all these pressures and demands for teachers, and it's not like you can spend your whole semester studying Age of Empires 4, for example. So,
Yeah,
so that's kind of my sense.
fair enough. Uh, Related question, of course. If you have time, there's an awful lot of games out there. There continue to be more every time. Last week we took a look at the Steam Next Fest and all the news from legally distinct from E3, but still just E3 this year.
Right.
There's so many games, and obviously we can't possibly play all of them in a classroom. So, do you have like a personal favorite of a historical game you like to use?
So I think teachers are going to be focused on whatever topic, whatever curriculum they're doing. I happen to be teaching an ancient world history course most of the time. And so for that ancient world history course, I need games that fit within that period, or at least I prefer to have games that fit within that period. We used Civilization for a long time, Civilization 4. I found that that's very challenging because it's such a big monster of content and learning to play. And so recently, just because somebody happened to develop it, there's a new city builder game out called Nebuchadnezzar by Nepos Games, Nepos Games. And I've started using that in my classrooms because we actually have a Mesopotamian unit that we're looking at. So I think there's lots of games that could be useful. And if you're teaching US history, for example, there are so many more games out there that are available that you could use to teach with. So it's not so much like, do I pick the games that are my favorites, as I pick the games that will fit in with my curriculum and then figure out what I'm going to do with it. So I got lucky with this city builder Nebuchadnezzar and have really been enjoying it.
Sure. I'd also shout out Soren and Layla Johnson with now Mohawk Games made Old World recently, which is that Civ-like. I mean, they are the Soren was the developer lead on Civ 4. That is now right in that niche.
Absolutely. Yes, I am a huge fan of the Johnsons. I'm a huge fan of Soren's designs. Old World is a great game. It's an interesting. I think that so remember you were asking me about how can you get games into the classroom, when you're worried about standardized tests and other things that you have to teach and be ready for. So what I'm going to try this year with Old World, because in my experience, the thing that I think is really important to remember is just because some of your kids will think playing a game is the greatest thing that they could ever do, not everybody's going to think that, and you really need to approach it as a serious historical exercise. So Old World has that gameplay complexity that Civ 4 did. So what I'm going to try to do, haven't done this yet, but what I'm going to try to do is like a one-day demo where the kids do some reading the night before and come in, and I do a session playing Old World for them and pointing out pictures, and then they give me some kind of written analysis. So I'm going to try and experiment with that. I don't know if it'll work because turn-based strategies, are not visually easy to process really quickly. If you an Assassin's Creed, which I'm not going to play with 14-year-olds because of the mature rating, but in Assassin's Creed, you can see the character moving around in the buildings and everything, and it's sort of in your face. A turn-based strategy requires a little experience, sort of processing what's going on.
Yeah, but I mean that's something I love about this sort of, I guess, demo, because that's similar to what I do here. Is that you have someone who at least more or less understands the system and understands what to look for, who can sort of guide that in a way that just handing them the game and saying, write an analysis of it, just would not work.
Right, absolutely. I think when you're using a game, you should be. I mean, I always want to be careful with should, all of you out there in listening community, because there's so many different ways to effectively educate. But for me, it seems that if you're going to use the games, you need to think about why they're useful, why it's educationally valuable, what one might get out of it, regardless of entertainment factor.
Yeah.
You can't count on you can't count on your students thinking, "Oh, this is great." Some of them will think it's great, and some of them won't. And B, even if they did all think it's great, that's not why we pick our educational our techniques, our pedagogies, and our designs. We don't say, okay, what will be the most fun? We say, we talk about engaging, right? And we talk about wanting to engage our students in active learning, but we don't just say, well, what would be the most fun? Because that would be like, falling asleep on the couch with a video game or something. That would be the most fun. So,
very much so. And unfortunately, right, there are definitely some games that are fun that are either fun in a way that is very complex, or the flip side of that is fun in a way that is so simplified as to not necessarily be useful for modern history.
Right. Well, and I think there one of the keys, I think, is to have students stop and debrief and analyze through conversation, through writing, through any number of other projects, right? Stop and debrief, because you can play a game. I mean, everybody knows somebody who does this, right? Who can play a game, and it can have all the theme in the world, and the player's not really even processing that, right? They're just focusing on the mouse clicks. They're focusing on the optimized strategy.
Yeah.
So you really have to stop and think and talk about the history. So.
Absolutely. And to that end, Age of Empires, I think, is in some ways a very clear example of that need. Because I know you've worked with Age of Empires 2 quite a bit, I know. And with good reason, I think that is probably the best of the Age of Empires. But it's obviously super weird historically, right? I think getting better as they keep releasing new stuff for the Definitive Edition. But ultimately, right, super materialist, super militarized understanding of like historical linear progression.
Yeah, and the thing about Age of Empires 2 that the reason I spent some time with it, I haven't actually taught with it yet, although if I were doing medieval history, I could do that now and would, is Age of Empires 2 is a classic example of what I call a game as a historical problem space. It takes the past, whatever that past historical content is, and let's assume that it's all come from, vetted, careful source reading and stuff. I'm not sure that's the case, but let's just assume for a second. Take that historical content and puts it into this historical problem space where there's a player agent in a world with obstacles and assets and resources who's trying to achieve goals. And you can see in Age of Empire how they took all this narrative of medieval history and worked it into a real-time strategy game. And so I was curious when you invited me to talk with you about Age of Empires 4, since they picked the same period, basically, I wanted to see what had changed, as far as the game imposing its systems on history.
Yeah, and I think that's what we are going to turn to now.
Okay.
So actually looking at the game itself, because I think in some ways it is a dramatic improvement, and in some ways it is very much not. In fact, in some ways I think it's actually significantly worse than Age of Empires 2 in 2022. Okay. So let's turn to that now. And chat, as we do, if you have any questions for myself or Jeremiah, please do ask. We are happy to talk about other stuff as we go. So.
Absolutely.
The big thing, right, Age of Empires 2 has this grand thing where all of the medieval period globally gets mashed into 4 concrete, distinct eras that are completely unrelated to each other that all cultures share. It's not great. So I think, right, the first thing that's a clear improvement is that their basic progression, despite having the same names, is actually quite a bit different. Just confirming, by the way, is technology cooperating?
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. So
This is great, and as you know, I've only seen the tutorials. I haven't had a chance to go through this, so this is really neat to see.
yeah,
How they.
absolutely. So the way we do progression in this is that instead of you just research the next age, like you did in Age of Empires 2, you actually have to build a landmark.
Right.
And
And I assume those are right, and those are divided according to the culture you're picking, or they're
exactly.
historically tagged. Yeah,
Yep,
makes
they're
sense.
culture specific. They do different things, and there's always two. Right? There are
Okay.
always at least two things that you can actually do. And so you get like the White Tower, so Tower of London, is just a bonus castle.
Okay.
Or, what is that? Buckingham Palace ends up being a town center.
Right. Right.
All the way building
Oh,
up to
interesting.
the Cathedral at Canterbury as their wonder
Okay.
that breaks everything. So, right.
Well, one of the things that's nice is that, I mean, it's a real time strategy game. So,
Yeah,
right? I mean, on a certain level, dominating your opponent's computer or human is kind of the name of the game. So, I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to know how many people went with sort of wonder building as their main way to win the game rather than defeating everybody else. Because it seems like 80% of the game is focused on defeat everybody else,
it
and
is.
maybe 20% on wonders or something like that.
It is. But interestingly, I think there's some pressure in Age of Empires 4 to pull different cultures away from that. So, right, I switched over to
Sure.
the Abbasid Caliphate, who, right, they've dramatically reduced the number of cultures from Age of Empires 2, which keeps adding more and more, down to
Right.
8 that they have deemed sufficiently long lasting, of which
Okay.
only the Delhi Sultanate is, like, chronologically weird, but picked some that they are sufficiently long lasting within the Middle Ages. So the
Right.
Abbasids are like 750 to 1517, which is technically true, but very technically. Um,
Right.
but their progression is based on the Baghdad House of Wisdom, and so instead of building a bunch of unique wonders for that, every progression is just adding on to the House of Wisdom. And the
Okay.
production from the House of Wisdom improves as you build more buildings. So you're strongly encouraged to just spam houses and make this one
Mm-hmm.
megalopolis centered on the House of Wisdom.
It's interesting. See, this is where I would say you've got the game design imposing a historical problem space on the past, right?
Absolutely.
Everybody has a wonder. Everybody has certain buildings, but going even a little deeper, right? A culture is expressed in terms of a wondrous building,
Yeah,
some flag color, right?
yeah.
And I don't know how many architecture sets. Maybe they have 8. I don't even
Yeah,
know.
yeah. They've upgraded enough that each culture has at least one unique architecture set, which is nice.
So cool. Yeah, yeah. So basically, they're saying, and there's nothing wrong with this, but it's important to remember that that's what the designers are doing. Is they're saying,
Yeah,
okay, these are the defining features of a civilization.
yeah.
This list of things. So,
Yep.
and they sort of shape it into that
And
that
exactly.
mold.
And so, right, the university if, is exactly the same. They've just reflavored it, and it
Hmm.
does the exact same things, but they've reflavored it to a madrasa, a
Mm,
uh, Arabic school,
interesting.
and right, it has no regard for when in the chronology does this show up, because madrasas
Right.
exist as early as the 8th century in North Africa.
Okay.
But for gameplay wise, right, it is a reflavor, and you're right to note that it is just a reflavor.
I
But
think some. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, you can go
Oh,
ahead. I was about to move on to another culture here that I think does something even more interesting.
I was just gonna say, and I think there must be decisions being made as stuff goes along that, okay, we need a center of learning because
Yeah.
every one of our civilizations is going to have a center of learning. Go do a research, what are some potential historical terms and concepts that we could attach that to?
Exactly.
Not in a sense that so we're writing like a research book on it, but so that we can pull in those elements from the past and present them to the players. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really clear here with the Chinese civilization, uh, because, right, they acknowledge, we've got a small issue of that there are no fewer than 4 dynasties in the chronology of medieval Europe active in China. You have the Tang, you have the Song, you have the Yuan, and you have the Ming. And this is an incomplete list. The Jin dynasty
right.
overlaps with the Song, the southern Song overlap with the Yuan, etc. But they're like, okay, we've got these. How do we deal with this? And the decision I love, right? Recognizing
Yeah,
that
that
they're
each one's an age.
sort of.
Yeah.
Right, each one is an age, but they recognize that this is a European imposition at the most generous. Really, it's
Right.
a fictional imposition, but at best, it's a Eurocentric imposition. And so what they do is that dynastic progression requires you to build both landmarks, while age progression only requires you to build one.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And then
Very
units become
interesting.
obsolete or introduced as you move into different dynasties.
Okay.
And so, right, you just aren't able to build certain units in the Yuan dynasty.
So they did, so there's a lot of careful thought into this,
Yeah.
which is great. I mean, you could see it when you see all the extra materials and stuff they had too. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, so it's really cool to see that, right, they're doing some of this stuff to encourage interesting mechanical play. Uh, I think it's right. They want this game to be a competitive game, as we'll
Sure.
get to AC Esquire's comment in chat in just a moment here. But right, they want it to be mechanical and therefore to have balanced but diverse strategies that also seem to more carefully refer back to historical periods. And that is not an easy balance, right? Because everything has to play roughly similarly.
Right.
But you also want to acknowledge the fact that, right, Age of Empires 2 has received a lot of justified criticism for its portrayal of not Western Europe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they also. I mean, it was also a design resources sort of thing and a logistics thing, right? Age of
Yeah.
Empires 2 was 99, I think, 1999. Something like that, and so they didn't have the. I assume it was beyond the budget of a major games developer to have stylized, detailed architecture sets for every single group. And so
Almost
what they did
certainly.
famously, yeah. So famously, right? They had I forget, but there was like here's an Eastern Asia architecture set. Here's a Southern Asia architecture set, and they sort of went on like that.
Yeah.
Um, this team clearly had the desire and ability to go a lot more granularly into that. It's interesting. Cool.
Yeah. The. Oh, looks like I'm getting informed that Twitch did not cooperate on my getting the correct stream information in. But in the meantime, it's interesting because, right, Age of Empires 2 is also, of course, still an active game.
Right.
Where the definitive edition released in 2013, and just very recently got a Central European expansion that focuses.
Oh, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah,
Oh, cool.
they added an entire new campaign around Queen Jadwiga of Poland.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, so it still is super duper active as a historical game, and I think some of the design ethos from Age of Empires 4 is kind of getting pushed back into Age of Empires 2, which is neat.
And just thinking about this as a teacher on top of being a
course.
gamer and a historical games person, I'm actually going to try. You remember where I was saying I'm gonna try and take Old World and do like a one class sort of lesson of it. Let's do some reading. Let's observe and talk about this thing in class. Let's do a reflection on it. as a way to get that in. It is absolutely my plan to do that with Age of Empires 1, the definitive edition, because that's for our ancient world history
Yeah.
class. Um, and I think when I wrote the first edition of Gaming the Past, I had very little time or patience for Age of Empires. I was like, it's just a madcap materialistic struggle for society in an
Yep.
arena trying to conquer everybody, and that may be how you view the world, but it's very simplistic at least. But now I see it as that's okay. The simplicities are okay because at the end of the day, talk about it with your students, read some
Hmm.
credible sources, analyze. And so I think all the Age of Empires would work very well as a one-day lesson. You can imagine, right, playing a skirmish and talking people through it and saying, okay, well, here's the units and this is how it works, and
Yeah.
it wouldn't be too hard to show the basics of, and that could
Absolutely.
be a good lesson. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the real power of Age of Empires is that right a game takes an hour and a half.
Right. Right,
Right,
exactly.
you can easily have assuming that you get like a longer period than a high school your average 1 hour high school class time. Well, you could easily do a split it in half. You do a full skirmish and then you talk about it.
Yep, absolutely. And if you have less time than that, I would argue that you could play 40 minutes of a skirmish and point
Yeah.
out things, right? Because you could at least get through. Okay, here's the advancing through ages,
Mm-hmm.
and notice how they divide time into these periods, and
Yeah.
does that make sense? Does that fit how we think about the past?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
questions like that.
Yep, and to that end, asking, how do we think about it, how do we talk about it, and do we actually have time or interest in the historical side of it? AC
Right.
Esquire asked, do people who play Age of Empires 2 nowadays engage with the history? Because in my more recent sallies to AoE2 content, the fanbase seems to be much more involved in meta strategies when playing certain factions than the history the said factions represent. Which is a good point, right? And
Absolutely.
I think we're in agreement that this is where uh, it's really hard to design a historical game that, in and of itself, is going to lead people to engage with that history outside of some very specific game modes.
Yeah, I mean, players are going to play how they're going to play, right? I
Yeah.
mean, we're all independent actors, and we get to decide. Okay, I want to pay. Like, take for example, let's keep it on Age of Empires 2 because the poster was saying that. You could focus on getting the names in your head of the cathedrals and things that you can build, and you could do some research on that. But there's nothing that makes you do that.
No.
And absolutely, I assume. I mean, my understanding of the competitive scene is when you get to that point, right? You're doing mouse clicks per second
Yeah.
or actions per second or whatever it is, and you're thinking about the game just as a game system, and you could be playing StarCraft or you could be playing some other game. So
Mm-hmm.
so I think absolutely there's no way to sort of say, okay, you will learn this. What you can do is try and make a system where it's appealing to learn some things, and hope that works. And then I'd go a step further as a teacher and say, well, I can't as a player, I can't tell people what they need to pay attention to, but I can absolutely have an analytical discussion afterwards and say, hey, let's talk about these things.
Yeah.
What would be interesting to me to see is the people that are talking about optimal strategies on in the forums. What's their sense of the history? Do they take nothing from it because it's just all kind of muscle memory for them, or do they have some opinions that might be influenced by the game? And I don't know. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating question.
And I think, right, the potential there that is much more of an academic one than an educational one would be, of course, are the optimal strategies for different cultures in any way reflective
Hmm.
of academic historical understanding of those different cultures, right? They're not obviously going to be the same because Age of Empires
Right.
is not the historical past. But is there a connection there, or any sort of parallels in how you navigate the simulation in an optimal context? I'd be
And I
super
think,
curious to see
yeah,
that.
yeah, I agree. And I think I think that also includes, because you want people to be aware that this is a modern medium and critical of it. That also includes how did the strategies for these different cultures get shaped by this game?
Yeah.
If you were doing a role playing game on the Middle Ages, you'd have different gameplay stuff coming in
Oh,
than you
absolutely.
do with this, right? And you have different things in a 4X in a turn-based strategy game. So, how did they take the cultures and express them through the game? So, like, quite literally, I would suggest that Age of Empires 2 is not the history of the Middle Ages. Age of Empires 2 is some history of the Middle Ages turned into a real-time strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is the RTS history of the Middle Ages.
Yes, and uh, I think the other half of that, of course, is at best, right? How do you bring those two things more in line? Well, you can't force people to do it, but you mentioned, right,
Right.
incentivizing people to do that, essentially, trying to make it appealing for people. Which is why I've now pulled up the achievement list
Oh,
for
interesting.
Age of Empires 4, because these are locked, right? These are frustratingly these little tiny locked things. Uh,
Right.
but as you achieve them, right? Firstly, right, it feels really bad to be like, oh yes, complete the required task to unlock this item. Gamer brain says no, I need the shiny, so incentivizes me to actually go do these achievements in order. But
Yeah.
when you do that, you get a historical blurb. So when you talk about hunting grounds, right, as part of the Rus mastery, well, Russia's vast forested plains made wood abundantly available to rural settlers who used it for everything from buildings to cutlery. Simple interlocking joinery meant that nails weren't required, so construction was cheap and fast. Wood did have one drawback, however, fire, but thanks to rapid construction techniques, a burnt village could be quickly rebuilt time and again. Now, this isn't the deepest historical note ever,
That's
but it
there.
is a historical note.
Right. I agree. And so what they've done, right, is set up a system so that if you're feeling good-willed about the history, if you're feeling curious about the history, they're going to leverage that and provide you with stuff to think about that you didn't find in many earlier games or even current games. The only thing I wish, and I guess I should say at some point, if I haven't already, I am not a fan of play a game and let a game teach you history. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it really works like that. It's where you go, okay, this game will teach me history, because history is not a list of things to remember. History is a dialogue about sources and their meanings.
Yeah.
So what I would say is what they've done here is really neat, and they should be proud of themselves for it. Why not put in your sources?
Yeah.
Why not have a bibliography and say this is where we were drawing from? And the reason is, I assume, is that it's difficult, but that extra step to be able to say, okay, here's my discussion of Russian forests, and this is where it came from, or maybe even a list at the end or something like that. Would be fantastic.
Yeah, while obviously clicking through to other pop-ups is vanishingly difficult, I would love if those citations were literally just a link, right? So even if you limited all of your sources to open access, digitally available things, right? That means it's going to be a bit out of date. But even if you limited it to that, to be like, oh yeah, right, you can just literally hyperlink to other sources to enable that further research rather than here's the Civilopedia entry, go forth and conquer.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, I don't want to be, I think that sometimes people criticize historical games and kind of miss the point. I mean, this is a game.
Yeah.
It is designed as a game by game designers to be an enjoyable and compelling game experience. So I don't fault them for not going in and doing the bibliography. What they have done is magnificent. Yeah. I'm just saying the final step would be to show that this isn't just, where it basically, who's telling you that information about the Russian forests? Well, Relic. Okay, well, there's a lot of people at Relic. Who at Relic's telling you that? Well, Jill. Okay, well, where did she get the information from? So,
Yep.
Sort of being able to track that.
Yeah, and we actually got to do that in real-time things to chat on previous streams of Age of Empires 4 when I was actually going through the campaigns, where we
Oh,
were
cool.
like, oh, they're putting out a blurb about this. This strikes my medievalist trained brain as being a bit of a weird claim. Let's try and hunt that down. Find it
Mm,
in some very classically Russian Soviet historiography about the Rus.
interesting.
And it's like, oh yeah, when you actually do that work and hunting it down, uh, another place where, having the guide and a collaborative learning approach
Hmm.
uh, really enhances the history in the game, but a place where when you hunt it down, you're like, oh, well, maybe there was a reason they were hiding this, and it's not always due to viewing sources as not aesthetically pleasing.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, there might be lots of reasons
Yeah,
that they don't go with it, but what you're talking about there is fantastic. I mean, at the end of the day, it's fostering discussion,
yeah,
and clearly, Relic here has done a lot more to foster historical conversation in this game than many historical game designers have,
absolutely.
right? Yeah, which is
Like,
really neat.
exactly, right? Even more so than the Assassin's Creed team, and right, as much as we love the Discovery Tours, the
We
Discovery
do.
Tours
They're pretty awesome.
are their own separate thing that is not incorporated into the base game.
Right.
This is in every level incorporated into the base game, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a really good distinction, and I think you're absolutely right. They're they're making, I call it a gamic history. I think most people would call it ludic. Uh, I don't know why I just don't like the sound of the word ludic. I'm
That's
sorry, I
fair.
shouldn't say that. Um, so this is their gamic history, right?
Yeah.
This is a real time strategy history of it, where Assassin's Creed does have to. I mean, Assassin's Creed could work it into their game. It's just the violence is kind of the premier problem. But it is interesting with the latest Assassin's Creed, right? With Valhalla, their Discovery Tour does let you play as a couple of historical characters, not people who certainly exist, but who might have existed. I believe
Right.
it's an English monk and a Viking merchant and
Yeah, and
things like
then
that.
briefly Alfred the Great, who very
Yeah,
definitely existed.
yeah. So I mean, and so they're going that way too. This idea of, if we can, let's not eliminate the game, let's not remove the game, but let's intelligently, sensitively kind of work the history, make a fusion, if you will, of the history and the game.
Yeah, and I think it's really good. I spent 9 hours breaking down the entire Discovery Tour Viking Age because that's where my graduate degree is in. And
Totally, I understand.
so, I mean, it was very impressive in very many respects. They made some dubious claims, but also, right, Maxime Deland has been an absolute joy in elaborating on some of the points.
Yeah,
And
he has been.
really
Agreed.
very very lucky that some of these lead designers are extremely on board with like actually talking to us and talking about their processes because right I freely admit that they have different goals and
Sure.
if that we need that combination right of historical game plus guide in order to turn these from being gamic histories into historical games or historical
Yeah,
gaming. I don't know. I don't
yeah.
exactly know how to flip that, but there is, I think, an over like a transition that is substantial between a gamic history and teaching history through a game.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that all of this kind of points to is, um, though there are practicing historians who don't kind of use this definition, I think more and more you find people saying that history is not solely or maybe even primarily an academic subject, though there is such a thing as academic history. History, I always call it like the curated representation of the past or the selective representation of the past.
Yeah,
Anytime we take parts of the past, however we access them, and present them to the present day, we're doing history. What an academic doing writing a book is not like wholly different from what a teacher is doing in a classroom, from what a game designer is doing with a gamic history, in that sort of core of taking the past or some content that supposedly accesses the past and presenting it to the present. So yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Uh, awesome. I would turn away from that. I guess I have turned away from that, and move from thinking about just the mechanics and the basic problem space of the game. Uh, right. Because a lot of what we've looked at so far is just what are the mechanics of the game in isolation, thinking in right your random skirmish. Right. I click quick play.
Right.
What history gets told to me? But Age of
Right.
Empires has campaigns, and these campaigns are what they are claiming are really important historical tools. So they've got, right, these pop-ups, these text blocks about various historical figures, historical things. They have videos that show up, talking about the legacy of the Normans or various other relevant aspects, right? Medieval paint, falconry and talking, some of those.
Right.
So they give you a ton of ancillary material. And yet, I will freely admit to not being terribly impressed with these. But before we actually do that, Di Serrano Lozano asks, right, the borderline between playing history and teaching history games could be somehow equivalent to that between serious and non-serious games. I'll admit I don't like that distinction, and that I don't think serious games are a thing. I think that's a bit of a contradiction, though I think the better way of saying that is I don't think non-serious games are a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough and have been working on this a lot enough that when serious games was first coined and popular, I used the term too, and it's fine. I guess the way I would look at it is the game's not. I'm not using the game to teach. I'm using the game as a medium, as a artifact, a cultural artifact, if you will, and trying to use that to get my kids critiquing.
Yeah.
So to me, I mean, I happen to like games. That happens to be something that fascinates me, and obviously there's a lot of interest in historical games. But you could do something similar with historical movies, or you could do it with historical posters.
Yeah.
Or you could do it with an oral interview where somebody, right, tells you what their experience of a situation was. In all cases, right, we're getting a selected representation of the past, and then if you're going to do some formal education with that, then you pick at that, you dissect it.
Yeah.
So to me, I mean, let's suppose we had whatever this thought experiment. Okay, we now have Age of Empires, the perfect representation of history. It captures everything that happened in the past. This is impossible. Okay, this can't happen. Captured everything that happened in the past and presents it in accurate ways and everything like that. Well, you've kind of basically made education obsolete and said, we've got a new authority figure for you. The authority figure is Age of Empires. Sit down and the game will teach you the Middle Ages. So it's not games that are quite reasonable in their history and games that are quite not reasonable in their history, both of them can be useful for thinking about how people engage the past, and how we might kind of critically look at it.
Yeah.
I guess is my sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I get to the same conclusion from the opposite direction, right? In my streaming project, right, I don't just play serious historical games, right? I actually don't like paradox games. I am, I think, the only person in historical game studies who really does not enjoy playing paradox games.
They are complicated.
But what that means instead, right, I've been playing a bunch of Elden Ring. I've been playing, right, I mean, Assassin's Creed games are not serious, but I'm playing a bunch of AC games. I've been playing a lot of... I played Golden Sun. I played a JRPG from 2002 on the channel as a historical game. And so, right, the whole premise of the idea that there are games that are good to talk about history with, and games that are not, I don't find to be all that useful, because, right, even fantasy games, right, Elden Ring, as much as it is not medieval, still has so many visual references, so many cultural references, and such a rich layering of names, that you can treat it as a historical game and pick at the assumptions of who gets what histories matter within the game, and then from that, what conclusions do we see, what biases are revealed in our own imagining of the past. So right, I got really mad at it when they were like, oh yes, the company of enslaved warriors who were forced to go into this underground city, and the expedition went badly and they started cremating the bones of their compatriots, and that turned them into zombies that the player can mindlessly murder.
Yeah.
I got real mad at that because that's a really obvious kind of blind spot in what we think about in historical agency. And the fact that it's a fantasy game lets them just come out and say that in a way that a more serious historical game would not do.
Yeah, and I think and Elden Ring is that was Elden Ring, your example, right? That you were just talking about. Yeah, I think is probably a good example of this. And I'll keep making this point too. Players are going to do what they're going to do. You know, I mean, games are not an authoritarian exercise where the game says you must do this, right? We all know, you know, some players can have their own goals. They can decide that they don't want to meet the goals of the game. They can take whatever they're going to take from it. So, and that's fine, and that is totally a thing out there. And so, so thinking about what does a person playing those games learn. If I had a choice, I guess I would say maybe informally I'd probably rather have them playing Age of Empires than playing Elden Ring if I was trying to have them learn something on their own. But it doesn't matter. They're going to do what they're going to do.
Yeah.
If you're going to make it a formal educational proposition, though, it's the debate, it's the discussion, it's you bringing up how this bothered you and talking about it as an example. That's the part that becomes really useful in a classroom setting, the being able to discuss.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And in a stream setting, I think that's so important too, because that's that juicy content that drives engagement on a purely stream level. Is having reactions and giving space to talk about those reactions.
Yeah, and that's really neat. As you know, this is my first live stream, so I don't have any experience other than this, but I can see from the little bits I've watched and seeing the work you're doing that it is a powerful form of informal education.
Yeah.
And so that maybe we're not talking about player off on their own history classroom. Maybe we're talking about at least 3 different learning contexts, right?
Yeah.
Player on their own, some sort of social and media enhanced dialogue, and a classroom as different ways that they might be doing that. Interesting.
And cool. For a formulation on that, stay tuned for a special issue of Games and Culture that I have an article in.
Nice. Well pitched.
Well pitched. Anyway, I want to turn back to that concept of like that formal educational claim, because I think right when the game itself is trying to position itself as making formal educational claims, even then when we know that's not what it's doing, I think that puts certain burdens upon it. Right, where Elden Ring is not pretending it's historical, even though it's layered with historical references.
Right.
Age of Empires 4 is claiming it and doing a lot of work to say, like, oh yes, we can teach you history through this. We can get you college credit through this.
Huh. Yeah. I mean that's sort of the ultimate claim. But stepping back a little to the first claim, that we can teach some history through this. I think. I mean, developers making historical games they're either making explicit claims that their game is attached to history, where they're spelling it out for you and saying, "Yay, here it is," or they're implicit. We can remember that a game designer could design a game on anything. It doesn't have to be a historical game.
Yeah.
So presumably, if they're choosing a historical subject on at least some level, it's a debatable level, but on some level, right, they're implicitly claiming to connect to a past, connect to an understanding of the past. So yeah, I think there is that. So you were alluding there to the University of Arizona project. Can you get college credit from this game, or with this game? Interesting.
Yeah, we're going to turn to that in just a moment, but since that was released after the game, I think I want to look at the historical claims in the game and its campaign mode first, and then we'll take a look at how they went about saying, yes, you can make this worthy of college credit.
Sounds good.
So, I've got the campaign lists here. I've played through all of them. And, I get the opinion that there's some really funky stuff in here. I know you played the Battle of Hastings here and had a lot of thoughts to start off with on how the scenarios and scripting works.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because it was this is my first exposure to it other than the tutorial, and the tutorial was pretty much standard Age of Empires fare, right? Get your farmers and your wood harvesters and your miners and all that.
Yep.
So when I played Battle of Hastings, it's so structured.
It's so structured.
Right, and to the point, and so my first thought was, well, actually, it's a thought that kept coming back: is this actually the game, or is this using the rendering engine and its abilities to present a story? Nothing wrong with doing that, but I'm always fascinated about how much can the actual main game itself speak to the past.
Yeah.
What I suspect, I just made it to the York scenario that you have next there. I haven't played it. What I would suspect is that you probably end up getting into a standard Age of Empires skirmish map at that point.
Yes.
And so there you can see the Siege of York, which historically is very much not a real-time strategy, right? Gets turned into a build your mines, build your farms, build your mill, upgrade your barracks, go to these levels. And so it turns that historical phenomenon of this Siege of York into the real-time strategy version of it.
Absolutely.
I assume it does that a lot, probably. It probably does that a lot.
There's a lot. It depends, like, scenario to scenario, how they go about doing it. But, right, the Siege of York one was actually, I wound up doing the classic Age of Empires thing of hoard up resources, build trebuchets, and then kill everything in the city.
Right.
Which was simultaneously really good and really bad, because the goal is just break the castle. And you're capped, really, right? You aren't able to get up to Imperial Age in that. I don't think you're even able to get up to Castle Age. So they, like, remove or limit your progression pretty severely. But eventually, and this was something where I was like, wait, this is actually really clever, right? The enemy AI just spams units at you. And so if you just bum rush the castle, it's actually pretty difficult to beat it. And so it encourages you to literally demolish the entire city of York, surround the castle, and then blow it up.
Interesting. Okay.
Which is wild, but given that they're condensing a brutal campaign of conquest across northern England into a single moment, I was actually really impressed by them doing that. A nice bit of getting the player to act in ways similar to how William the Conqueror acted.
Yeah, and along those lines, I was thinking, somebody could come along and say, well, let's take this focused war game. I'm just like making one up hypothetically. Here's a focused war game on the Siege of York, and it properly focuses on the soldiers and the structures and things like that. It doesn't have all this real-time strategy add-on, but one could say, right? Well, but it is actually capturing something realistically about William's campaign, that even though William may not have been setting up peasant farms and laying them all out, there was an economic underpinning to all these things and a social underpinning. Yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah, and gives you space to do a little bit of cultural history, or psychocultural history on, right, what concerns may have been relevant that, to William's mind, justifies what we now recognize to be horrifically brutal and, like, economically crippled the north of England for centuries.
Yeah, right. No, that makes a lot of sense.
And then, right, so that's like Age of Empires at its best, right? Either has these single battles where it's able to really script them out, or these scenarios that really do capture a microcosm. And right, you see that in some other places, like the Battle of Kulikovo in the Rise of Moscow campaign, is another one where they really heavily scripted out. So you pretty much just have your military, you get the units you get them, and then you run up, and you actually like have tactics moments of you go up, you push forward, and then there's a counteroffensive and you have to fall back. And they just script that out for you, so there's very little room for question on that. Just in some way referring to what later descriptions of the battle describe as some of the movements in this battle. And they just script that out for you, so you don't get a choice.
That still becomes useful, right?
Because yeah, it's great.
If you happen to be doing that in your class, I don't know how many people are doing that or the Battle of Hastings, but supposing that you were going to do it, right there you've got somebody's vision of the past. I was struck by the fact that like archers kept showing up and said, "New archers have joined the Normans." I don't know, because I haven't really read about Hastings in quite a long time. Right, they weren't cycling in new units. The game does that because that's how it teaches you, how to play with these units. So there's lots of room in there to get into it and discuss it. Yeah,
absolutely. But the problem is that then we also have like other things, because the game's campaigns make very explicit historical arguments. I'm gonna quick show this Norman Legacy video, which is the conclusion to the thing. I think it highlights it. Yeah, we'll do this one, because the Norman campaign, I think, highlights my issues really clearly. So we're gonna quick show this, and then, right, it pretty much lays out its historical argument in no uncertain words.
William Marshall's success in retaking Lincoln was an overwhelming victory for the Royalists. The rebel barons had been defeated, and their French allies driven out of England altogether. William Marshall now focused on creating a stable kingdom for the young King Henry III.
Hooray!
To maintain the backing of the rebels, in 1217, a royal seal of approval was given to a reissued Magna Carta, limiting the power of the monarchy. Many barons held lands in both England and Normandy. But now they faced a choice. On which side of the Channel would they make their home? Many chose England. The cross-Channel kingdom was over, establishing a clear English identity. But the impact of the Normans on England's evolution is still felt today. Almost 1,000 years later, the surviving Norman castles and cathedrals still dominate the landscape. In the midst of the modern city, William the Conqueror's fortress, the Tower of London, remains a powerful reminder of their legacy. But it's the unseen influence of the Normans that endures. The Norman invasion changed the English language and established the foundations of modern parliament and governance. And it's all because one man, William the Conqueror, claimed the English crown that he believed by rights was his. The Normans conquered a country and changed the course of England forever.
You see, there's some pretty grandiose claims in there.
Absolutely.
Some rather egregiously grandiose claims in there, actually. Right, conveniently not mentioning, even though they mentioned, right, it was a reissuing of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta would be reissued 4 more times. It's not that significant of a document, but then really saying, oh yes, right, there's a clear single line from William the Conqueror straight through to the end of the Second Barons' War that lays the foundations of modern England, which is a big claim. It's a big claim.
Yeah, that's a big claim.
In order to justify that claim, they do some shenanigans with chronology. Right, I highlighted this in our pre-stream conversation, but right, and in the streams when we play through these, look at the dates, chat.
Oh,
1216,
interesting.
Dover, with the invasion of Louis the Seventh, Louis the Ninth, the King of France, into Dover in support of the Second Barons' War. Then they jump back to 1215 for the Siege of Rochester, and then they jump to 1217 for Nicola of Lincoln's relief and
Right.
her defense of the city. You can't do that.
But I mean, so yeah, but we were talking about this a little earlier, and I guess I hadn't seen the screen closely enough. I mean, they they made it clear that it's not in the right chronological order. I mean, at least from the
Yeah.
listing there.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would think. I mean, again, you can design any kind of game you want to, but it would be more egregious historically if they had like left those dates out and somehow you were playing through and thought that it went in that order. So
Yeah, and yet, right, mechanics trump text boxes, and so, right, you have to play 1216 before you can play 1215.
yeah,
Right.
that's interesting.
The scenario structure mandates that historical argument even as they, like, try and undercut themselves by acknowledging the dates.
Do you know what that's based on? I mean, is that based on a certain mechanic in the 1216 game? That okay.
No.
It almost makes me wonder if we were introducing this game piece, this gameplay element, and we needed to do it in this order. Yeah, it's really interesting.
My best guess is that it's a narrative reason of that basically they're introducing the Second Barons' War as an incursion by the King of France,
Gotcha.
and then going through the Second Barons' War with that framing as the background.
Gotcha.
Which I don't love, because something really important happens between these two, and that is King John dies.
Right. That's yes, the bigger problem.
It is kind of a big deal when you're changing these to justify the Siege of Dover as an act of King John's poor stewardship of England after his death. So instead of being, oh yes, right, he has poor stewardship, and therefore the King of France tries to help out, so much as there is an open revolt, King John dies, and the King of France goes, oh goody, here's my opportunity.
Right.
Those are massively different motivational claims.
No, you're right. I mean, or rather, what you're saying makes sense to me, not being a medievalist myself. Yeah. At what point do you say, just don't do this? At what point do you say, just don't do this? I mean, I have in my mind, because at the end of the day, my sympathy is usually going to, believe it or not, my sympathy is going to go for the game designers.
Oh, my sympathy always goes there.
Yeah, I do some amateur game design. I know how hard it is to design games, and it's a pretty magnificent thing. Thank you that they do that. But this may make me turn a blind eye. I picture somebody going, oh, but if we kept this in, it would make for the most magnificent game ever.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
So like, okay, well, we'll just make sure the dates are clear at the top. But yeah, I mean, at some point, maybe should have gone. I mean, the alternate though could have been like, no matter what, I don't care how cool this game is going to be, we can't flip that, and we can't get rid of John dying when he's supposed to be dying.
Yep.
Yeah. Would love to talk with people about why that was developed. I would love the inside story.
I would love the inside story. And right, chat, to be clear, right, all of my criticisms come from a place of deep respect and love, and wanting them to be able to push that often just 5 or 10% farther into thinking and trying to introduce more nuance into their games. And it's not meant at all to denigrate how magnificent the game at its best points actually
Absolutely.
is. And the overall success of it, because overall I think it is a success. But,
oh, absolutely.
Right, all of these campaigns, I think, do make the similar historical claim of that this medieval past, in some way, is relevant because it fundamentally shapes modernity. The rise of Moscow, right, talking about the rise of Russia, and saying that the medieval past outlines the future of Russia in the year of our Lord 2022. is a bit unfortunate. You can't have predicted that. I don't blame you.
Right.
Okay, but you also could
Right.
have
But in
predicted
this
it because
context,
Vladimir Putin has been doing Vladimir Putin things since a long time. So you totally could have predicted it, just not that it would come to a head right now.
mm,
But still, right? All of them
no,
make
I
that same grand historical claim, and I get it, but I'm also suspicious. Like that feels to me one of the clearest cases where there's the non-professional historians writing big history of the campaigns.
yeah, I mean, this goes back to claims being made, right? I mean, there are stronger than just there's the implied claims. As I said, you're making a historical game, and so there's an implication that you're connecting to the past. But this stuff's pretty explicit. They're throwing these arguments out there,
Yeah,
and if they're going to throw those arguments out there, I'm with you. Fantastic game. But as a work of history, if they're going to throw those arguments out there, then that means reasonable people should be able to discuss and critique them.
yeah,
Right. I mean, if we can discuss and critique, well, I mean, who's going to take away our ability to discuss and critique? I mean, hopefully this will be something we can always do as a species. So yeah, they put it out there. We talk about it. If you're in the classroom like me, the talking about it is what makes it fundamentally cool. So, and none of this detracts from the game designer's skill and craft at making a game. And it's not going to stop me from enjoying it as a
no,
game player, but I'm going to treat it differently as a historian.
absolutely. I am sometimes bad at distinguishing those two things because that's what I find fun about games. Right? I find the act of critique fun, which is why I do this on stream, where I can do
Sure.
long form let's play and perpetually critique. But uh, it is interesting. Anyway, I want to move over because they make these big historical claims, and in a context that's very much militarized. Something that we didn't mention, but I just want to throw out in passing. Right, the page of history from history about the Second Battle of Lincoln talks about how the sheriff, Lady Nicola of Lincoln Castle, was this crucially important figure in the defense of the city. And Age of Empires, has these hero leader units, right? You can play as William the Conqueror in the Battle of Hastings. You can move him around the map. You can't do that with Lady Nicola, even though
Huh.
one of her allies you can.
No, it's too bad.
I
I
know.
wonder why.
I think internalized masculinity. Right, playing that. As far as I know, there are no female leader units in the game.
Yeah, and I think I was looking at something in the game, yeah, at the beginning where they were doing that. It did seem to be a very male dominated list. And I mean, game designers have clearly found lots of creative, interesting ways to include more people that have been great. And I think ultimately, this is where I think notes becomes a really important thing too. Is to say.
Yeah.
Well, like for example, I see somebody in the chat was talking about Matilda. Yeah, I mean that would be an example where you have somebody who's historically well documented, and you could put her in the game,
Yeah.
and then we're representing women. But you could also have fictionalized women in roles of power because women did hold power at times. And for me, I'd just say that's where some liner notes would be really good. That's where
Absolutely.
I'd go. Yeah, that's where I go. Okay, we understand that there was a patriarchal system set up. However, we're not living in, or at least we shouldn't be living in a patriarchal system. So let's make some decisions for inclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Magistrate here is looking at this 1141 one, where it says, right, the Empress Matilda of Scotland, made her move to the English throne, fueling the fire of the Civil War. Talking about the anarchy, talk about Empress Matilda fighting against King Stephen. And then, when you start the mission, her brother Robert of Gloucester is the playable hero unit.
Oh, that's.
Well, he was the military commander for Matilda. Having her on the field would have been so much more fun.
Yeah, that seems to me to be that's a missed opportunity.
Exactly.
I think it's just a missed opportunity.
Exactly, and that is overall my opinion of this, is that when the game is at its... the basic game, when it's at its best, does some really interesting mechanical things with its historical
Hmm.
problem space, and then also has a few missed opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, that would make
But
sense. I agree.
what's funky about this, though, is that they straight up say you can earn college credit by playing this game. So let's go back here to get the music back up, and then click over to the University of Arizona's page on Age of Empires 4's website. And I will switch
Okay,
this over for you too so you can see it.
thank you.
Hopefully this goes without a hitch, we promise. Uh, where is it? Age of Empires. There. Chat, you get a glimpse behind the curtain. So hopefully that goes off without a hitch, and we get to see this. Where did the music go? Music. Sad. Oh well. We've only got a little while left anyway. We will live without music. So, let's look at
Sure.
this. Because for each campaign, they have learning modules.
Oh, interesting.
And really quite comprehensive ones. We're not going to read through most of these in detail, partially because we don't have much time, and partially because, I do. This is all free to access with a Xbox Live account, i.e., a Microsoft account. You can
Okay.
just log into the Age of Empires website. And so I don't want to, totally step on their toes here. So the only one we're going to look at in super detail, I think, is this first statement of learning through and with games, recreating, reenacting, and playing the Middle Ages.
Interesting.
Because I think that is a super interesting thing.
Yeah, this is exciting. I mean, Well, I guess I don't have an Xbox account, so I can't. I'm a PC gamer. Oops.
Yeah,
Um,
my Microsoft account works.
oh, okay.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll check that out then, because I would be very curious. I mean, it. I'm assuming that the educators that are developing this are kind of leaning into it and saying, here's some, here's some historical context that we can give you. Here's some things that you can explore in the game. What would be interesting to note, I don't remember if you were saying this earlier on or not, Adam, is your sense looking at this that most of the historical content is supporting the game rather than actually what the game itself is doing?
that is a very good question. My actual sense is that it is, broadly speaking, not. That it is
Okay.
independently extremely good, but doesn't have a ton of relationship to what's being presented either in the game's ancillary material or in the scenarios themselves. So, right, so for this Norman campaign, all of their illuminated history learning modules are about the Bayou Tapestry, which
But I
is
guess,
great,
yeah, okay. I was just
but
going to say, just trying to get my head around this. So, is this something where this is an online course that you could choose to take and get your college credit for?
yeah, so the way this works
Okay.
is if you complete the campaigns with all the bonus learning content and the modules, then at the end, when you completed all four of those, you get an examination. You pass the
Okay.
examination, and then if you enroll at the University of Arizona Online's history program, they will give you one college credit for this.
Well, that I mean, that I think shapes how we should look at this. So, the person taking this class, right, is not the person who's taking a medieval history class or whatever, and then the games are being brought in as a way to critique modern media and look at the past in different ways, right? The
Yeah,
person for this, right, is somebody who thinks it's a cool idea, presumably, and really likes the idea of Age of Empires being something that can give them some access into the past. So while I think it would be nicer if the game itself, like the central models in the game, were more front and center, this makes sense to me as a way to try and appeal to people who might be interested in the game and use that as a way to access some more detailed study.
yeah. The only thing I would want to see, right, is just that it's tied a little bit more closely. Uh,
Mm. Yeah.
because
No, I agree.
right, they look at the Bayou everything about this is the Bayou Tapestry, which
Right.
is awesome, right? It's a really good piece of cultural heritage to be engaging with as a way to pick apart the ideas of the transitional period between pre-conquest and post-conquest England,
Right.
which
Right.
is great.
Absolutely.
Like Paul
Yeah.
Milliman does an extremely good job with these. Right, I've read through all of these ones in some detail, and right, they are really good. I would put them
Interesting.
on par with like a freshman and intro level undergraduate course in terms of the quality of the information represented. And so, right, I mean, you wanted them to talk about their sources.
Yeah. So there's citations, and we also know. I assume Professor Millman,
Yes.
my eyes, or Milliman, um, wrote this. So yeah.
Yeah.
So we no longer have the nameless, faceless presentation, right? We now have an identifiable person who's doing it. That's great.
Exactly. And, they open it up with, the start of our illuminated histories is a
Oh,
video.
cool.
Right, most of it is text, right? They've got most of these actual lectures are text. So, right, they talk about, like, Dolly Jorgensen, who is the person to be citing here.
Okay.
Someone in my own education was, like, really did rely on for environmental history in a Norman context. But
Cool.
when we load back over to here, which we're experiencing a little bit of lag, right? They start off as an illuminated with a video created by Doctors Futrell and Milliman. Dr. Futrell is the head of department for the University of Arizona's history department, and Dr. Milliman is their medieval specialist. And so, right, they actually have a video when it loads.
It's impressive. It's really
It's,
impressive what they're trying to do here.
yeah. Oh, big lag. Chat, this lag is on my screen, not yours. So that's not going to work. I love trying to window capture on Twitch. Really, I do. Right, Dr. Futrell? So right, they actually are like, hey, yeah, we have like people with names and faces actually
Real
talking to
people.
you to start. Exactly. And then they intercut that with Age of Empires footage.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And
Cool.
the detail that they get to go into is super cool. So right, they talk about like, oh yeah, women and gender in the Bayeux Tapestry. There are only 3 women portrayed in the entire tapestry, but extrapolate from them to talk about various roles elite and non-elite women may have had and the power they exert. Food and drink, the Black Death, women warriors, and they do that with a wide array of different materials, right? So, food history, environmental history, gendered histories, trade and social histories, military history, a really wide survey of different types of historical inquiry.
Yeah. That's really neat.
And it's all really good. It's just, right, the fact that we have a module entirely about exploring elite women, and here, talking about the Ruse campaign and female warriors in a Rus or Viking context. Hey, look, they're referring to the BJ581 burial, which if people who have been in my chat for a long time know about this burial in detail because I talk about it all the time. Right, talking about Saxo, Prudentius, and then debates about women actively engaging on battlefields in not just a Scandinavian context, but, right, a 12th century manuscript in the British Museum between the battle between faith and idolatry, based on Prudentius. So a 5th century poem in 10th to 12th century contexts that depict virtues as female warriors.
Interesting.
And so, right, a really, really, really good overview that then expands, right, a little bit of, right, acknowledging diachronic shifts that the Middle Ages are not unified, and then providing a bibliography with credits for the
Yeah,
images.
that's great.
Yeah,
Yeah, they're
but
making it clear. That's great. I think that's fantastic. I'm glad to see this. This is really interesting to
yeah,
see.
but then doing that in contrast with, Empress Matilda and Nicola of Lincoln literally not existing as assets in the game. They're name dropped, but they literally don't exist within the play space of the game.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if the authors here of this material addressed that. I think it's a tricky position, right? You're probably in a tricky position if you're trying to leverage the game to do some historical education. Um, it may not. I just think it's a little tricky to get too much into saying, "Hey, here, this is really problematic how they develop these things."
Yeah,
But it I still think it's a really I still
I've
think it's a really cool achievement. I mean, this is important stuff.
yeah I've
It never occurred to me to do this. I'm focused on the classroom, so this idea of turning it into a whole online learning experience is really impressive.
I mean, I'm extremely impressed with it. I'm mostly academically interested because it's a fun tension between there
Hmm.
being
Hmm.
uh something that is clearly very well researched, very well written, and a good like public adaptation of an intro medieval survey course
Right, right.
using the platform of Age of Empires 4, but not necessarily exploring the historical problem space and the mechanical presentations of Age of Empires 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm most interested, like you, in games that set up these historical problem spaces and then trying to kind of pick at that. I think the problem there is still that we have games that are mostly focused on a limited number of topics.
Yeah.
Some economic, mostly political, often military, and so to actually have a rich representative history of the Middle Ages, you're going to have to break off from what the game's actually covering. At least a little bit. It would be interesting to go through. I mean, one could imagine, and they may do this here. They've clearly put a lot of thought into it. One could imagine saying, okay, look at agriculture in the game. How's it represented in the game? Well, here's
Mm-hmm.
the reality of agriculture. And so there are probably ways where they can key into it. And maybe they did. But
Yeah.
that same example, right? But by the same token, if you're looking at women and their roles and importance in the Middle Ages, you've got to go beyond what's being shown in the game, or there's nothing to talk about, and that would be a fundamental misrepresentation.
I agree. Right. I think my critique is mostly focused on the game not even attempting to mechanically explore this and not really even asking those questions uh so that
Yeah.
it leaves the online module to pick up the slack. And they do it admirably. I have no qualms whatsoever with the content of this, and
Right.
I'm absolutely thrilled that uh Relic partnered with them in order to do this, because this
Hmm.
is literally never before seen. Right? I
Right.
mean, just last week, Ubisoft announced that they're actually developing curriculum guides for the Discovery Tours that are
Yeah.
getting released, which is super exciting.
Hmm.
Though,
Very much so.
personally, almost makes redundant the project I was working on, so that's exciting.
Oh.
Uh, oops. That's okay.
Oh dear.
We went a little bit broader than just Discovery Tour, so it's fine. Uh, and I think we're targeting a
Good.
different group of people anyway. Um,
Quite
but yeah,
possibly.
lucky, lucky for that. But my question, looking at all of this, is just can Age of Empires as a problem space actually address some of these? Right. So we've got a thing on the Black Death here, in the Hundred Years' War. And it's well, that's super cool, right? How does disease work in Age of Empires?
Does it?
As is, it doesn't. But
Yeah,
could
okay.
it? Could it?
Well, sure, and that's the part. Yeah, I'm with you. That's the part that fascinates me is how somebody takes the game, what they're showing in the game, and how that is represent. I mean, it's historiography, right? It's like
Yeah,
looking at how people write history, but instead of looking at how they're writing history, I want to know how they designed a game to do the history. But it's the same sort of process again, where you look at some sources, hopefully good ones, hopefully corroborated ones, right? And those sources give you some connection to the past. They're not the past itself, right? But then with those sources and that connection to the past, you're still shaping it. You're still deciding what you're going to pick and how you're going to represent it. So yeah, so I would love to see the plague in the game and a conversation about whether it's modeled effectively or not. Barring
yeah,
that, I think it's an interesting conversation. Why not have the plague in the game?
yeah.
Arguably, because it's no fun for anybody. Nobody
True.
likes the plague.
But the entire mention of the plague in it as is background justification for you to have a scenario where you are just murdering peasant revolts.
Mm, okay.
So I don't love
Okay.
that.
Nope.
Turns out not a fan. So, right, can we make that mechanically more interesting without making it suddenly not Age of Empires? Right, because
Right.
that's
Right.
itself a conversation. It's just right. This is Age of Empires, and clearly most closely to Age of Empires 2, and so
Mhm.
you almost can't diverge too far without breaking the franchise aspect of it.
Right, but again, I think that's true of every game,
Oh
right?
yeah,
It's the designer's task is not how do I make a game history of the Middle Ages. The
yeah,
designer's task is how do I make an Age of Empires game about the Middle Ages.
yeah,
And that's going to be different from Kingdom Come's RPG version of the Middle Ages. That's going to be different from never played it, but The Sims Medieval. I'm
yeah,
sure was a very different one. So
yes,
yeah, it's always taken that.
yeah, and right, I have
Well,
full respect for that, but
me too.
that's like that 5% more that I super want. Is now that they've
Sure.
shown right that they are willing to take this step, and this is not an insignificant step.
No,
Right?
not at all.
How do you roll this
No,
back
it's a
into the game?
right. That's an interesting question, and I guess that's something well, yeah. I mean, I guess it's something where you could take it as an educator and try and turn it into a discussion part of about the game and put them together.
Yeah,
This is assuming somebody who's remote and not having kind of live interaction with teachers.
yes, yeah.
And
This
it's
is
and it's a really impressive way to approach that, I think. So
yeah, uh, and yeah. I guess my concluding thought is just full agreement with that. If that is absolutely remarkable, and not something I ever particularly expected uh, game companies to hop on board with this level of eagerness.
right.
And I just want to see. I want to be able to time travel 5 years in the future and see if and how this project affects how people making historical games think about what their games can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's all to the good that historical game lovers are finding more and more that historical games are answering these questions, or at least trying to tackle these questions of
Yeah,
education. So yeah, I agree. 5 years from now, hopefully, we'll be even further along. But it's great that we have some trailblazers.
exactly. All right, so I think that basically covers everything I wanted to get through here. Uh,
Yes, me too.
yeah,
This is great. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure seeing all this stuff. Thanks so much
it
for having me on.
yeah, this was absolutely wonderful. Do you have any, I guess, concluding thoughts over what we've seen today, or about uh, final recommendations for this conversation and teaching with Age of Empires or teaching with other games more broadly?
I mean, my kind of final thought is talk about it.
Yeah,
Discuss. I have this kind of naive but really important conviction that reasonable people that are using evidence and speaking to each other in nice tones can really make the world a better place sometimes. And so talk about it. I mean, engage people on the history in games and what's accurate and what's not accurate. I think. without that engagement, there's going to be a limit to what you're going to be learning. And with that engagement, you don't have to be in a classroom. You can be anywhere, but it's the debate, it's the discussion, it's the thinking about it, and asking yourself, what does the evidence support and what does the evidence not support? And
Yeah.
talking with people about that
Yep.
on streams or wherever.
Yeah, and right, I love that you talked about like mentioned the accurate and not accurate there, because of course, as much as the academic community is I think growing weary of that particular
Mhm.
question, I think it still does have a place, especially in like educational and outreach work, uh, as just
It does.
getting people to ask the right questions.
Yeah, I mean, and my definition of historical accuracy, I call it defensible models.
Sure.
Do the models that the game presents about the past, are they something that you could support
Yeah.
reasonably with reasonable sources? And if so, then that's going to be historically accurate for my purposes. That, by the way, that doesn't mean sit and learn from this. It's going to tell you what to think. But I'm just saying, is it reasonably fitting what the historical sources suggest, or is it not reasonably fitting what the historical sources suggest? And there is a place for that, definitely.
Yeah, I think you and Rob Hodden would be in complete agreement with both that framing and that conclusion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree, which is good
Awesome.
because Rob's got some really important thoughts on this. So,
Yeah, I'm hoping to get him on one of these days.
oh, fantastic. That'll
Yeah.
be great. I'll watch.
Anyway,
Okay.
where can people find you online and soon once again in press?
Oh, sure. So I have a website that I've maintained for about 10 years, gamingthepast.net. So gamingthepast is all one word. .net, and everything's free on there. It's mostly geared for teachers, but if you're interested in historical games, there's probably some interesting stuff there. I occasionally will do some blogging there about historical game topics. You can kind of see that. So that's sort of my main presence. I'm on Twitter and try to be pretty active on Twitter talking about historical games. Gaming the Past is my handle there. And I wish I could recommend to you Gaming the Past, but let me say this. The second edition has a lot more in it that I think will be interesting to people who are just interested in historical games. It's still a handbook for teachers, how to approach teaching with them in the school, but I have a feeling that people that are interested in historical games, whether as just players or designers, will find some more there. So that's coming out with Routledge in 2022 at the end of November. So
Fantastic.
great.
Awesome. So thank you so much for joining me. It was a delight to have you.
Thanks. It was really great to do this. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I hope so too. And
Great.
thank you, chat, everyone, for watching. We'll be back, or I'll be back as usual on Thursday. But until then, I hope you have a good rest of your weeks, and I hope you all very much enjoyed this. All right,